The old mill stood on the edge of town, its dark, weathered walls a stark contrast to the bright green grass that surrounded it. It had been abandoned for years, and no one dared to go near it after dark. One night, a group of teenagers decided to go to the old mill to see if the rumors were true. They had heard that it was haunted by the ghost of a young woman who had been murdered there many years ago. The teenagers arrived at the mill just as the sun was setting. The air was still and silent, and the only sound was the faint creaking of the old mill wheel. The teenagers stood in the shadows, their hearts pounding, as they stared up at the mill. Suddenly, they heard a noise inside the mill. It sounded like someone was crying. The teenagers crept closer to the mill, their eyes wide with fear. The crying grew louder, and then they saw a figure appear in one of the windows. It was a young woman, her long hair streaming down her back. She was wearing a white dress, and her face was twisted with grief. The teenagers watched in horror as the woman raised her arms and screamed. Then she disappeared into the darkness. The teenagers ran away from the mill, their hearts pounding. They didn't stop running until they were safe at home. The next day, the teenagers told their friends what they had seen. No one believed them, of course. They said that the teenagers had just imagined the whole thing. But the teenagers knew what they had seen. They knew that the old mill was haunted by the ghost of a young woman who had been murdered there. The teenagers never went back to the old mill, but they still talked about what they had seen. They told their stories to their children and grandchildren, and the legend of the ghost of the old mill grew over the years. One day, a new family moved to town. They had a young daughter named Sarah. Sarah was a curious child, and she loved to explore. One day, she wandered off to the old mill. Sarah didn't know about the legend of the ghost, but she soon found out. She was walking through the mill when she heard a noise. She turned around and saw a young woman standing in the shadows. The woman was wearing a white dress, and her long hair was streaming down her back. Her face was pale, and her eyes were filled with sadness. Sarah was scared, but she couldn't look away. The woman reached out her hand, and Sarah took it. The woman led Sarah through the mill, and they talked for a long time. The woman told Sarah her story. She told her how she had been murdered, and how she had been trapped in the mill ever since. Sarah listened to the woman's story, and she felt sorry for her. She promised the woman that she would help her find peace. The next day, Sarah went back to the old mill. She brought flowers and candles, and she said a prayer for the woman. The woman appeared to Sarah again, and she thanked her for her help. She told Sarah that she was finally free, and she disappeared into the light. Sarah never saw the woman again, but she never forgot her. She knew that she had helped a soul find peace, and that was a gift that she would never forget. The old mill is still standing today, but it is no longer haunted. The ghost of the young woman has finally found peace, and she is no longer trapped in the mill.